Good morning, and welcome back to the second day of Access 21, a virtual connection. I'm Demita Snow, Senior Manager of Publishing Technologies at the American Society of Civil Engineers and the Program Co-Chair for Access 21. I'm so thrilled to have you here. First, I'd like to acknowledge our partners who contributed greatly to this year's event. Thank you all for your valuable support. I invite you to connect with our partners through the Partner Showcase, Partner Playground, and the Networking Lunch. To kick off our day, I'd like to recognize our CES Premier Partner and Access 21 Gold Partner, Destination Canada Business Events, for their sponsorship. Destination Canada has been a longtime supporter of CES and the Access Leadership Conferences, so we are grateful for their partnership again this year. I invite Destination Canada to share a few words before we begin today's sessions.
Good morning. Bonjour, everyone. When I graduated from my engineering class back in 1999 out of the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium, I was one of only 12 women, close to 100 graduates. It was not an easy path, but I was passionate and I was strong in my field. Since then, the numbers have grown and lots have evolved to address the barriers and cultures that stand in women's advancements in science and engineering. Yes, we're still far from the finish line, and I could not be prouder to be able to address you today before such an important keynote topic that is near and dear to my heart. My name is Virginie de Vischer, and I'm the Senior Director of Business Development, Economic Sectors for Destination Canada. I'm here today to talk to you about the underrepresentation of women in STEM, which not only has attracted considerable attention, but has impacted me and my perspective. So I would like to share a few thoughts on this with you. In a 2016 report, Statistics and Insights on Canadian Society showed that women made up 34% of STEM bachelor's degree holders and 23% of science and tech workers among Canadians of working age. This shortage of women in STEM is widely recognized as detrimental to women, since science and tech occupations, particularly in engineering and computer sciences, are among the highest paying and fastest growing occupations. Additionally, numerous analyses have found that greater diversity strengthens innovation and performance. Despite extensive research and a high degree of policy concern, unfortunately, progress in improving women representation in STEM has been uneven. According to the American Association of University Women, in the US, the statistics are even worse. Women make up only 28% of the workforce in STEM, and men vastly outnumber women majoring in most STEM fields in college. I could go on talking about this subject quite extensively, but of course, I'm not your keynote speaker, and I will leave this discussion to the experts. That being said, I wanted to bring those numbers up because our two vast nations can learn a lot from each other. As two neighbors sharing the longest border in the world, the connections between our countries are plentiful. And Canada is a very diverse and tolerant country. While the world has halted for a while, it has given us the time to pause and appreciate each other even more. Absence really makes the heart grow fonder. We can't wait to welcome you back with open arms and share that deep link that connects us. Most importantly, we invite you to Canada to continue to tackle the important challenges that our world faces, such as the gender and culture gap in the STEM fields. Association and society meetings and events are a great place to start. They challenge the status quo, they educate, they create opportunity to brainstorm and explore, they create networks for innovation and improvement. When we've been focusing on ourselves for so long in the past many months, it's time to get out there and explore, to come and meet us again. Reconnect with your Canadian counterparts, and let's create more room and opportunities for diversity and more opportunities for growth. Let's put more women in those seats. It's time for a little bit more Canada.
Thank you, Destination Canada. Our first session of today and the second keynote session of Access 21 touches on the very crucial topic of women in STEM. I'm so excited to welcome our panel of women STEM leaders who will discuss progress, continued obstacles, and what we can do in our professional societies to realize the full potential of the scientific workforce. I'll invite our moderator, Mona Miller, SES board member and CEO of the American Society of Human Genetics, to the virtual stage to lead the discussion on this significant topic. Thank you, Mona.
Well, hello, and thank you. Thank you, Demita, for the introduction. Thank you, Virginie, for the opening, a very relevant conversation. One of the things I love about SES and SES meetings is that you always learn something new about someone. And I didn't know you had an engineering background, and it just brings that much more connection between our partners and our members to know of the deeper connections that we all share in addition to our roles in association leadership. So thank you very much. It is a pleasure to welcome everyone back to day 2 of the Access 21 meeting. And I will say that our second plenary has very big shoes to fill after a fantastic opening session yesterday with Deirdre Simmons, who really set course for the themes of this meeting, really focused on ensuring that we're able to harness the benefit of all minds and voices in the scientific and engineering enterprises. And we're going to continue that conversation today. I really want to applaud Bob Chalker and Demita Snow for really prioritizing this conversation in both of the plenary slots. And I think it speaks to both the urgency and the agency that associations and societies have in creating lasting change, real and demonstrable change. Today, we're going to talk about some of the challenges, but also some of the work that's underway to really create change both here in the United States and, as Virginie and many of our speakers are going to discuss, the global realities of an uneven inclusion in the workforce. So I will note that very briefly that I was a women's studies minor, and so it has not been. It's always been a pathway that's been a passion for me, and I think each of us has that opportunity through our individual work to really create change for women in particular, and women especially who have the double burden of intersectional affiliations and identities. So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to do just a very brief introduction to the topic at hand, and then we're going to turn to 3 quite illustrious speakers to talk more about the subject matter. I'd like to send a special thanks to Melissa Garcia, who was my partner from the Program Committee on SES in shaping this and bringing to our attention the video that we're going to watch, the PBS session, Picture a Scientist. And so in starting, that's what I'm going to ask you to do, is to, in your mind's eye, picture a scientist, because I think today's discussion is part of changing that narrative and what we can do as communities to do that. I'm going to guess that maybe somebody like this came to the fore more diversity in the scientific conversation. I'm curious if anybody brought these folks to mind. These are Nobel Prize winners, or potentially should have been Nobel Prize winners. Levi Montalcini and Marie Curie and Ross Franklin. And then these are our leaders today. And I think this is such an exciting array of scientific expertise, brilliance, knowledge, application. And we want to talk about how we can support more generations of these leaders coming up through the pipeline, because I would say that today they are still, we are still struggling with a community of scientists and engineers who are needing to persist through a lot of challenge. And we applaud them for doing so, including my current president, who I will mention, Gail Jarvik at University of Washington. So they have persevered through cultures and challenges that we have an opportunity to address. The reality is that our pipeline still looks too much like a slide. I'm not going to go through all of these details, but consistently through the scientific learning pipeline here in the United States, and Virginie noted that it's also true internationally, we have parity at K-12 education, excitement, interest, capacity. And somehow, through this transition, through the academic experience, we lose the leadership and capital, the human capital that really drives a lot of our progress forward. And so what are the outcomes? Again, won't go through these details, but the progress is there, but it's modest, extremely modest over the last 20 years. And one of the themes that I would love our speakers to talk to today is what's going to be different this time around as we start to tackle these changes as a community. But underrepresentation continues. You continue to see the slides in degree granting, and then of course the salaries also face major disparities between male and female scientists. What else has been the outcome? Most recently, there's been a lot more studying and a lot more, I think, attention to what are the remedies. I think we're moving beyond the problem, and some of these groups are beginning to look at systemic change that associations and societies are well positioned to be a part of. And so I just noted a few of the recent reports and activities that are underway to begin to address these challenges. I think what we're here today in many ways to talk about is to focus on culture and climate. And I do want to point out the 2018 National Academies study, many of you are familiar with, that focused on sexual harassment, but actually it went well beyond that. And I think it's really important for us to note the synergies and the spectrum that culminates in a culture and climate that may push women out of the scientific arena. Some of it is sexual harassment, the overt, unwanted sexual attention. The iceberg is so powerful because these are the daily kinds of sexualized experiences that women may face in scientific environments. And I want to include a third area because this comes up in the video that I hope, the PBS documentary that I hope people have watched, will watch, but the diminishment. Some of us may experience this in the association landscape as well. The patterns of disruption and interruption between male colleagues and women, the assumptions about gender norms that lead women to be the ones that order lunch or get coffee or take on the extra volunteer burdens that may change culture over time, but also have consequences for recognition, tenure, scientific visibility. And so these are also facets of culture that I think that we experience, that women experience, and that societies are well positioned to help tackle. So we are going to watch today a short trailer from the Picture a Scientist documentary, and then we are going to turn it over to a discussion about associations and scientific directions for associations and societies. So with this, Sarah, I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we're going to turn it over to watch the short trailer. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
This genetics, this molecular biology, that was the answer to all the questions I'd ever had about everything. We were just trying to be scientists. We certainly didn't want to be seen as troublemakers.
People said, what happens in the field stays in the field.
It was bullying from day one. He would tell me women were altering the science on the ice for worse.
What's going to happen if I report him? What happens if I don't report him? It was getting really physical.
I didn't tell anybody because who's going to believe you? You know, nobody.
Women are extraordinarily underrepresented in science.
When you ask somebody, draw a picture of a scientist, it used to be all men.
There's a playbook, and it was written by men. And I always felt I didn't have the playbook. I'm just feeling my way through this game.
You get used to being underestimated. You get used to being invisible.
These are great scientists. How can they not believe this?
Many of the women that I've spoken to have left.
This is the leaky pipeline.
They cannot say the evidence doesn't exist.
So I thought, okay, I have to show them it's true. So I wrote, there's a kind of systemic and invisible discrimination against women. Can we really afford to lose those top scientists?
He just needs to look at the data. That's what he'd want us to do for his science.
You cannot do everything on your own. You need enough of your allies to make something happen.
I expected to fight alone. I didn't expect anybody else to fight with me.
Together, we can do better.
Let's move away from a culture of compliance and towards a culture of change.
If you don't have women, you've lost half the best people. Look at the talent of these women. This is worth fighting for.
Thank you, Sarah. I really encourage you to watch it if you haven't. It is sobering, it is powerful, it is promising. There is progress noted in the documentary, but it is slow, which was one of the themes of the discussion and what it is we are here to discuss today with three really august leaders. That I will introduce in just 1 second. So as it turns to us, associations are people organized for a joint purpose. And one of those purposes is to make sure that we are tapping all of the potential in the human mind and the human experience in the scientific and engineering enterprises. And just wanted to, of course, note, as we know, that as communities of people, we are fundamentally about the business of setting, reinforcing, changing values and cultures through the work that we do, the words that we say, and the priorities that we set. And I know that is one of the themes of the sessions today. And I want to highlight that we are doing a lot. There is a lot of work underway that's very positive. And this is just a quick snapshot from a number of different engineering and society organizations. And the list goes well beyond this, of the kinds of work that associations are undertaking to help build awareness and create change. And so I think the opportunity today from Shirley, Jackie, and Julia is to build on this work and help us focus it and sustain it over time. So these are some of the questions that I think we'll tackle today in terms of what the climate reality is, what's working, new and novel, what some of the remaining challenges and persistence is that we need to find, and reaffirming our intent to continue to create change. And we have a fantastic panel here today. Jackie O'Brien is going to open the session. Jackie is both a leader, an association leader, and an engineer by practice and training, had served on the board of Engineers Without Borders prior to joining as CEO. We'll ask her to speak to her experiences, both globally and in the United States. Next will be Shirley Malcolm, who needs no introduction. And we are so glad to be able to have her here today. She's Senior Advisor for AAAS and leading a really profoundly important new initiative called Sea Change through AAAS to really build that systemic change. Shirley has advised leaders, individuals, institutions, nations on these issues for more than 30 years. She started as a very young girl. And we're really glad to have Shirley, who will speak to some of the work that's underway to create that change, and Julia Judish, who is special counsel at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman. I remembered when it was just Shaw Pittman. In full disclosure, I've had the opportunity to work with Julia on some of these issues. And I think one of the things that's really special about her work is her dual commitment to realizing change and helping organizations do it within the governance and legal frameworks that we need to apply. And she has refused to choose between those things. And so making advances in culture and climate is possible and important within governance structures of nonprofits. And so we thought it would be very helpful for Julia to speak to some of her experiences with nonprofits and associations specifically in creating this change. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Jackie, and then we will come back for dialogue within this group and conversation with you.
All right, thank you so much, Mona. So I have to say I had not seen this movie before, and so when I watched it, when I went into watching, I didn't quite have expectations. But I have to say, the very first scene where we see Jane, and she talks about taking her 3-year-old daughter into the lab with her, and her daughter sees her, what the work that she's doing, and looks and says, "Mommy, I want to be a scientist." And Jane breaks out crying. And those are tears of joy, but they're also the reality of knowing what her daughter might face. And my reaction, my thought was, I've never heard this expressed before by anyone other than me. And this was sort of a theme that got carried through the movie about women not realizing that there were so many others kind of in the same situation as themselves. And so I have 3 daughters. I'm obviously a mother, also an engineer by degree, as Mona had mentioned, and raised my daughters talking about science and math and engineering. And in fact, our bedtime stories were often these incredible, dynamic stories of engineers saving the world, scientists saving the world from chemical disasters and natural disasters and all of those things. And so when my oldest daughter was entering college and informed me that she was changing her major from a medicine career to a engineering career, I was obviously very proud and supportive of her. But I have to say, there was this kind of nagging voice in the back of my mind that thought, would she ever come to me and say, "Mom, you never shared the full picture with me"? Inherently, that was 20 years later. Obviously, things had changed. Policies have been put in place. The numbers continue to grow. I think I saw that the stat Mona said was about 20% of degrees are engineering degrees are issued to women. So knew all of those things. And it was a different experience when I had gone through 20 years before. For me, when we were in elementary school, my family moved to Lima, Peru, where my father, for his company, started up a new manufacturing facility. And while he wasn't an engineer, many of the people he worked with were. So I knew from a very, very early age that I wanted to be an engineer focused in international development. And I remember I was so excited in college or high school when it was time to apply to college, and going it down and talking to my guidance counselor and kind of laying out what it was I wanted to do. And he said, "No, it's a bad idea. It's a really bad idea. This is not, you need to reconsider. This is not the right thing for you." And I just remember my reaction. I have a brother a year older, graduated from the same high school, essentially same classes, same everything. And he'd gone to study engineering, and said those things. And the guidance counselor saying, "But it's different for you." And when I got to school, I realized it was different for me. I remember walking down one of those giant lecture halls, where there's more than 100 students sitting there, and just like looking, searching for that two other women in the class. But I made it. I graduated and went to work for a large international manufacturing company. And I was the first woman hired in a heavy manufacturing facility. And I saw and experienced a lot, right? But I also saw that change as policies were put in place, as more women were hired, the calendars came down, the posters came down. When things were said, you could call it out, and knew that you had kind of that protection there. So I was so surprised when my niece, who's 17 in high school, came to visit from out of state a couple of weeks ago. She's pursuing, she wants to be a scientist. She's going to get her PhD and wants to be in cancer research. She got the opportunity to work in a lab as a high school student, which I understand is very rare. And she was so excited about the opportunity, yet so stunned at the differences that she saw in how men and women were being treated in the lab. And I couldn't quite reconcile that with the experience that I had went through. This is now more than 30 years later. And it really wasn't until I watched this movie that I realized what she was talking about was essentially that iceberg, that what lies beneath, whereas maybe what was, we experience a little more of what was above. It is all of that lies below that continues and to be addressed. So much has changed, but yet we have so far to go. And that brings me to my current role as CEO of Engineers Without Borders USA. So I had a 30-year career in industry, and a year ago during the global pandemic, stepped into this leadership role. The organization is working on almost 500 projects in almost 40 countries. And if you think about this organization, it's a lot of students and young professionals that take on some of the most challenging projects. They are time zones away, they're the language barriers, the cultural differences, all of the lack of infrastructure, the just about, never enough money, just about every challenge you can think of to go in and implement an engineering project somewhere else in the world to help a community. Yet these young students and professionals succeed. And it is the dedication, the passion, the tenacity. And one of the things when I joined the board several years ago that I was so impressed with the organization was, at that time, it was about, a little over 40% of the 10,000 volunteers were women engineers. And that, I'm thrilled to say that we just tallied the numbers again, and we're at 45%. And in my mind, there was this question about what is it about this organization that attracts such a high percentage of female engineers? And I'd been asking those questions and kind of got two sort of answers. And one was essentially the model. It is by nature very diverse. You bring together a team of engineers based in the US and with communities around the world. And so you have a lot of diversity, and it is a true collaborative partnership. So everybody has an equal voice. And it was this idea of this model where a diverse group of people come together with an equal voice and work to solve a problem. That was extremely compelling. The second, I think, was just inherently the numbers. When I joined the board, there was her experience, just at her university, walking into her club and finding that more than 50% of the club members were women. And she did not have that experience anywhere else in any of her classes and any of the other organizations she was in. And she talked about it feeling like home. So those are kind of the two views that people bring up when they talk about it. And as I was getting ready for this session, I actually did some more research to see if I could find. And I found that there was a 2014 study done at the University of Colorado, funded by the National Science Foundation, to answer this exact question. Why does this organization, why is it so successful in attracting such a large population of women? And what they did was, obviously they looked at a controlled group, did hundreds of interviews, and what they essentially found was that women self-identified at a much higher rate with Engineers Without Borders. So it was that I am a woman engineer, and I am within Engineers Without Borders, much higher rate than men. And what the study kind of concluded was this experience was really finding a sense of belonging for women in the engineering space that they just weren't finding anywhere else. Right. So it was a really compelling study. It was done in 2014. Obviously, the numbers have continued to climb. And while we're at 45%, I'm really looking forward to the day that we hit that 50% mark, and we're working hard towards that. I will say we are expanding our efforts. It's not just about women, but all of the other diversity, and we've signed MOUs and are heavily focused on that. But the other thing that's clear, this is just not a problem in the US, right? We know this is a problem. And last year we had released, we got involved in a 3-year study, and it was about equity in engineering in sub-Saharan Africa. And we released these findings just before last February, just before the pandemic. And the study looked at kind of 2 attributes. One was specifically for the University of Ghana, their current population, they've got about almost 5,800 engineering students, and it was about 14% women. In faculty, they had about 7% of their faculty was women out of the 170 STEM or engineering faculty. And what they really wanted to figure out was how to increase those numbers and how to increase success in gender equality. So that was part of the 3-year study effort. The second, in parallel, was coming up with student-led projects, which would demonstrate how STEM training could really drive social and economic impact. And so this was kind of a competition where students presented potential projects, again, all very STEM focused. And the 5 teams were selected of 30 to 40 students, and these teams were judged on 2 aspects. One is that they needed to promote equity and the impact. So this STEM initiative that they were going to take on would show how women in the community would benefit. And then also inherently the structure of the team. It needed to have an equality in terms of women engineering, both as contributors and then also as leaders. And the projects that were selected range from pollution prevention and addressing, and to things like renewable energy. And to no surprise, what came out of it was obviously good project outcomes are heavily dependent and improved when you bring in very diverse perspectives. So these lessons are being incorporated into policies, and we're working with the university to incorporate and drive change within the university. And again, all with the target of really trying to get to that equality of men and women within the engineering field. So so there's, again, lots of progress, lots of work to go. And I'll just kind of conclude this session with really coming full circle on kind of my journey through this. And when years after I had graduated, I was on a beach vacation with my husband and kids, and happened to run into that guidance counselor. And I pointed to my husband and said, "That's him. That's the one that told me I couldn't do this." And we went up and introduced ourselves. Of course, he remembered me. And after talking, he said, "What did you ever end up doing?" And I said, "Well, I became an engineer and working as an engineer." And he was just very surprised. He said, "I thought it was too hard." And as I inherently reflected on it, it really was hard, but not for the reasons I had thought it was going to be hard. It wasn't the math and the science and the engineering classes. It was all of the other stuff with being a woman in STEM. So I am so appreciative. I'm really glad we're having this discussion, this conversation, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Mona.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie. The documentary in part is powerful because of those personal experiences and stories. These are not just data and charts. These are people who are driven by small comments. I know some of the AIP work has highlighted how those single comments can last a lifetime and shift a course, or as you pointed out, show the resilience to pursue it, but you didn't forget it. So important work. Shirley, we're going to turn to you to talk as you wish about your experiences and the work to date and your current drive to really bring systemic change through Sea Change.
Thank you, Mona. Let me just share a screen if I can find it. Okay. Okay. I am pleased to be here, and I'm pleased to be a part of this conversation. And Mona was so gracious as to only say I have been doing this work for 30 years. Sorry about that, Mona. It's more than 40. But it means that the film had particular meaning for me. I am not going to talk about my own journey, but if you can imagine, Black woman, Jim Crow South, science, and then graduated from high school in the year of the Children's March, 1963, and going to the University of Washington, which is not exactly diverse land. So and then as a woman of color, all of a sudden being confronted by biases that relate to my gender as opposed to my race, or in both of them. So it's a long story. But one of the things that I do want to say is that we have come a long way, but we have a long way to go. I started as at AAAS actually after I married and moved. I had been in a faculty position, and the first job that I had was as a research assistant, trying to identify the programs that had been undertaken for minorities within the sciences. These were intervention programs that were being pursued by lots of different universities and museums and what have you. And this work was published in 1976, 1977. And subsequent to that time, we did similar work at AAAS, looking at programs that had been undertaken for women in science. And that was published in a 1979 kind of a framework. But the point that we really got to some while later was begin to understand why all of these intervention programs, which had basically sprung up over time to try to move the needle on these concerns about diversity, why weren't they actually making a huge difference? Why wasn't the needle moving? And one of the things that you began to understand is that the needle wasn't moving because most of the work was focused on fixing the women. Okay, we weren't making it in those kinds of environments that were being offered to us. And so we needed fixing. Okay, fixing how? Fixing so that we could manage, live within, negotiate this very, I don't know, this very male, white male space. And so a lot of the isolated programs that you see really related to the individual commitment. People volunteer to stand up these programs. And in many cases, they did it with no money. And the thing that becomes really clear to you as you think about it over time is that that is not going to move the system. And so over time, we began to think very differently about the needs and where we needed to locate to focus our efforts. And that's when we began to understand that we needed systemic reform. We needed structural reform that was basically built into the hard dollars, the real money that institutions spent, and we needed institutional commitment around this work. So the movie was very moving to me personally, because I lived through that time. And one of the things that I will share is that my daughter was a student at MIT at the time that a lot of this was actually going on in terms of the work that Nancy Hopkins, who is a friend, had undertaken to try to show that there was really something that it was inherently wrong about being undervalued, being diminished, etc. And so Chuck Vest was also a friend, the president of MIT at the time. And Chuck had asked me if I would give the opening remarks to this workshop that he was setting, that they were having on the MIT 9. These were the other institutions that participated in this work, basically pledging to do a similar kind of a survey and study that had been done at MIT to look and see whether they had the same kinds of things operating for their women faculty, their senior women faculty. And so when talking to Chuck about what he needed, he said, I want to make sure that everybody starts from the same space. And so I want the data. So, but I want more than the data. I want the stories, because it is absolutely crucial that we have the stories that go along with the data so that people can begin to understand what is happening with regard to their senior women leaders and faculty within the institutions. And so this workshop was with the presidents of these institutions, or the provost, and the women who were there, and being honored to participate in that and to try to basically tell some of the stories of what people were encountering at the time. It's absolutely amazing that the whole question of bias within the institution really hadn't clicked in, that it is the bias of the institution as well as the bias in the institution that was a problem. So we worked on these issues for a long time, and in trying to find a strategy that was systemic, trying to find a strategy that will allow us to move the needle. And we were basically directed by several of our friends who came to visit and had spent time at Athena Swan. And we were encouraged to look at Athena Swan as a model that could possibly move the needle in this, because it was directed exactly where it needed to be. And that was with regard to the institutions and bias within the institutions themselves. So Athena Swan was established in 2005 by a group of senior women in the UK who basically had just given up. They'd just thrown up their hands and said, we've got to try something different. And so the idea was to establish a process of self-assessment where institutions would basically look deeply at their own policies, programs, practices, processes, and identify where they had the challenges. And the idea was to incentivize the institutions to do this by offering an award. You get a bronze award if you essentially go through this process of self-assessment, reflecting on your numbers, and then moving to the next level, which was to put forward an action plan as to how you were going to move those numbers and how are you going to move that climate. And so Athena Swan was basically signing up members, and institutions were undertaking this process. And one of the absolutely brilliant things about it was that you did not get an award and keep it forever. Essentially, you had to renew it, in their case, after 3 years. And part of the renewal was, what did you accomplish in your from your last applications, from the action plan that was there? And the idea was that if you accomplished what you did, you could possibly apply to go to silver, and so on up to gold. Now, similarly, like you would think about something like LEAD, but the notion is you incentivize positive change. So the focus was on gender equality. the and it was the process was moving along well. The initiative was moving along well, but it got a push. It got a boost when Dame Professor South, who headed what is their equivalent of the National Institutes of Health, just got tired of seeing the things really not change. And in 2011 announced that any institution, any department that wanted to come into one of the solicitations for their center, for their big grants, basically had to have at least an Athena Swan Silver. All right. All of a sudden, everything changed because having your ability to pursue these grants, having that ability depending on having this award, stopped everything in its tracks and got everybody's attention. They were serious. They were not kidding on this. And so what it meant was that she said, in 4 years, this will be the rule. This will be the case. And so all of a sudden, departments started to scramble in order to move into this self-assessment process. And in the process of scrambling, you have to understand it wasn't just about the departments. The institution, you could not have a silver as a department unless your institution had at least a bronze. So it was pulling the entire system into a space of being much more aware of gender equality. There's lots of details. I'm not going to share them, but just so that you know that the Race Equality Charter was established in 2015. The Australians established SAGE. We established Sea Change, in our case, though, not doing these separately in terms of gender equality, race equality, but doing them together because of our concern about the intersectionalities. And so we have been on this journey since 2017 of identifying and bringing along the institutions that are interested in really moving the needle within their institutions. And I will note for that Canada basically has its own version of this, Dimensions. And I will also indicate that India is considering also looking at this, apropos to the comment that was made earlier about the fact that this is a global problem. So the issue is that we can only move this by actually using the culture of our disciplines, okay? That we focus on systemic change, that we have to address the departments and the fields, and that is where the professional societies really come in. We decided that the scale of this was going to be impossible for us to manage as AAAS, even though we were standing this up, that we would deal with the institutional level, but we wanted to recruit the professional societies to work with us to stand up the departmental level awards, actually looking to change the culture of the field. And so now I will say that the first ones who came up, thank you, the physics and astronomy community. Thank you, Beth Cunningham. Thank you, AIP. Thank you to APS, to the Astronomy Association. Thank you to the National Society of Black Physicists, the National Society of Hispanic Physicists, all these groups, Optical Society, coming together to begin at least to identify a framework for physics, for astronomy, because the nature of the fields are sufficiently different that you have to put the context, build the context into the frameworks that the departments will be looking at. The geosciences have telescopes, and they have, I mean, the astronomers have telescopes, the geoscientists have ships, and they have other kinds of things where there's field work. And so you've got to be able to take this. So we want to look at the intersectional identities, address harassment and bias, and use positive peer pressure in order to really begin to make these changes. Now, why is this the case? Some of you are familiar with this experiment where postdocs were invented who had the same CVs, okay? And the questions were raised by men and women faculty about around their assessment of these postdoctoral candidates, and it looked at physics and it looked at biology. And so remember, the CVs were the same, but they put male and female names on the CVs, on the same CVs, and minoritized the names, as it were, on these CVs as well. So what do you think happened? Well, actually, in the case of biology, it wasn't as bad, but still, you know, you get what you get. But in physics, it was really quite clear that they preferred the male candidates and they preferred the white and Asian named candidates, and they did not want to look at the thought of hiring these other people, even though it was the same credentials. And we have, in fact, other examples of this. I don't know how many of you knew Ben Barris. He had published under, he was transgender. He had published under Barbara Barris, and he gave a presentation at one of the meetings. And he said that someone came up to him and talked about how much they enjoyed his work and his presentation, and that they liked his work so much better than his sisters. And I think that was such a profound moment for Ben. He was one of the biggest allies that we had around these issues. This is my last slide to really help you kind of figure out what Sea Change is. It is an initiative of the AAAS to try to bring about the kind of climate change that we're talking about within these fields. That, in fact, it consists of not just the awards aspect, but the institute, to try to build capacity. Not everybody is fully cognizant of the research that has been done and of the work that such as that I just cited, that informs what we do around inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion. And the third component of Sea Change is the community, where we can begin to offer moderated conversations and webinars and other kinds of things to help people understand the nature of the issue that we're trying to face. The nature of Sea Change as the initiative is top down, bottom up. We depend on our professional society colleagues to stand up the bottom up section around departmental level review. But we've also offered the opportunity for professional societies to undertake the kind of work that Sudha Parikh actually initiated within AAAS after the killing of George Floyd, where we take a similar kind of a sea change look-see at ourselves as professional organizations. And we have, we received support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to seed this work in other professional societies. So we have experiments going on right now where some of your colleague associations are looking at themselves in these kind of deep dive issues, who are our members, who benefits from our programs, who's publishing in our journals, who's on our editorial staff, all of these things that are part of the enterprise that either make or break in terms of being inclusive. And I think that we have an opportunity to really change our fields, but we have to be honest about the challenges that are sitting inside of our fields, including the discrimination and the bias and the harassment, and become really intolerant of bias and harassment at the same time that we're trying to move our fields forward. It is absolutely crucial that as we undertake the kind of big things that we have to face as a country and as a globe, that we put forward the best science and come up with the best technology. And we can't do that unless we are diverse, equitable, and inclusive.
Thank you, Shirley. It is at this moment, right, of being able of systemic change. And thank you to the physics community for piloting this. And I know many fields are having conversations about getting ready for the next wave. So, Julia Judish, please join us, and we will look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Mona. I feel like I'm the interloper here because I am not a STEM professional. I won't tell you my grade in calculus. And also I am following in the footsteps of the presentations of Shirley and Jackie. So you may be wondering, what is she doing here? Some of my very favorite people, friends and family, are in STEM, and many of them are women. So I am comfortable with that culture, but I am a lawyer. And my focus, and I think why I was asked to participate here, is not because I have expertise in STEM, but because I focus on policies, on governance, on procedures, and on the law, and what it can and can't do. So let me share my screen. So I think you're all here because you think that associations do have a role in equity, but sometimes it can be a hard sell to boards who want to know, why should we get involved, or to what extent should we get involved in these issues, which aren't really our core mission. Our mission is the science that may be somewhat controversial with our members, and that may involve things that aren't necessarily on the professional society's turf. I think certainly following the Me Too movement several years ago, many professional societies and associations did make sure that they had event conduct policies and were paying attention at least to gender-based, sex-based misconduct that happened at their events and on their turf, but weren't really focused on setting the tone of the culture change more broadly. So I think it's important not to underestimate the importance of the role that associations and professional societies can play in gender equity. They are the community for the profession, apart from academics, the academic institutions and the employers of the individual professional members. I watched Picture Scientist as well and echo how powerful it is, and urge any of you who haven't watched it to watch it. One of the questions in my mind, one of the threads involves a Title IX action against a harasser. And my question was, what happened to him? Often what we see in the cases of misconduct is that the institution may take action, but then, this is, if it's someone who has earned grants and who has a good reputation, they just move to another institution that doesn't even necessarily have that history, doesn't know that there are these issues. And so find that institution or employer has purged itself of someone who has created a harmful culture for others, but they've just moved on elsewhere. The associations don't have that limitation. Also, the law is setting a floor. It deals with the conduct that's in the movie, they draw an iceberg, and the behaviors that are above and visible are the ones that now the law prohibits: discrimination and harassment, if you can get to the proof of it. But there's a lot that goes on below that. And the law is a very important tool, but it is not a sufficient tool at all in terms of leading to compensation equity, to hiring equity, to retention, to workplaces that are welcoming and inclusive. That's not what the law is just designed to do. There's a lot that's in policy and procedures and expectations that set the culture. So associations have enormous power in establishing norms and expectations for their members. And let's not diminish the power of norms. To use a couple of examples in terms of the internal power to control what you do, think about walking onto an elevator and turning backwards to face everyone. How difficult that would feel to actually make yourself do. Think about going into a restaurant and leaning over to another patron's table and taking some of their meal off their plate. The social norms against that are incredibly powerful, such that you wouldn't do that. There are things you might say with friends that you wouldn't say in front of your grandmother, or, to use an example, sometimes people use that in front of the Queen of England. So people are responsive to their social context and what is expected of them in that context. And associations can move the needle in terms of what is deemed acceptable, what is deemed desirable for treatment of women, of non-binary individuals, of people, of minorities, people who don't fit the paradigm picture of a white male engineer or scientist. Associations can also take action, and we'll discuss that. I'll discuss that a little more later, that supplements what employers can do. There's the problem of the moving harasser. And associations play an enormously important role in providing representation and role models and creating new opportunities for recognition by peers for women in the profession. So as professional society executives and those who belong to professional societies, you do have to proceed carefully, however. You can't just dive right in. I work with many professional societies and associations who, contact me because they have found out that one of their members has been disciplined by the members' institution. They don't want that individual coming to their events anymore, and can't they just eject them or expel them? And the answer is not necessarily, at least not yet. Associations are bound by the nonprofit organization statutes in the jurisdiction in which they're incorporated. And here I'm speaking to US law, which is the only law that I'm competent to speak to. And they're bound by their governing documents, by their articles of incorporation, by their bylaws, by their policies that have been adopted. Sometimes the background statutes place limits on how or why a member can be stripped of membership, how or why an officer or board member can be stripped of that role. Certainly the bylaws often speak to that, your policies speak to that. There's also legal risks to associations from acting outside of the authority of those governing documents. If you take action against someone and it's public, they may bring a defamation suit against you, the association. Associations don't have to follow the full level of due process that court does, but there is a common law right to due process, and the minimum of notice and an opportunity to be heard must be provided to those who the association is seeking to sanction, at least if the sanction is loss of membership or loss of a role that they are entitled to hold under the association's procedures. Associations have great power in one sense, but they have very limited legal power to act as fact finders. Perhaps with their members, depending on what the policies are, you can get them to cooperate in terms of providing information if you're looking into something, but you don't have the authority to subpoena witnesses, unlike, say, a professional licensing board, which can look into things. So sometimes associations need to step back and piggyback on fact finding of other institutions, other legal bodies, even if they're aware of what's going on, especially for conduct that doesn't happen on their turf. Many associations have conduct codes which seek to set the culture and the expectations, but are written broadly or in aspirational terms that members should treat each other with the highest level of respect and ethics. And there is a place for that. Those are important codes to have and expectations to articulate. They're very hard, though, to enforce. They need to be paired with enforceable, clear prohibitions. Associations are also limited in what they can do in terms of taking retroactive action, going back to the basics of due process, notice, and the opportunity to be heard. If you adopt rules now for behavior, that's great for now and going forward, but there can be problems with trying to enforce those rules after the fact on behavior that occurred before members were subject to those rules. So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer and say that there's nothing you can do here. There is an enormous amount that associations can do, take steps to change the culture and be agents of change and move the needle. So let's start with developing and enforcing conduct policies. That's the low-hanging fruit, especially with respect to association activities and events. This is what you do, your area. You should ensure that your conferences, your meetings, your online messaging and communication boards are safe places for your members and don't include the kind of behavior that makes it painful and difficult to be a member of the profession for women and for other marginalized members of the profession. Many conduct policies have now gone beyond that as well to address issues relating to the conduct of their members that occurs in their professional roles, even if it's not in connection with the professional society itself. You want to think about how you're going to phrase that. What do you want the scope to be? Do you really want to be involved in adjudicating complaints that relate to, say, a member's dispute with their neighbor or what's going on in their personal family life? Sometimes when there are deep-rooted personal animosities, someone who is aggrieved goes to every kind of source they can to try to make there be sanctions or consequences for the person who has aggrieved them. So what is the appropriate scope of the conduct policy, that's a question each professional society will need to consider and decide for itself. But many have landed on, is this behavior that relates to the member's professional role, their interaction in the workplace, their interaction with graduate students, their interaction with staff, their interaction with colleagues? Does it affect how they move through their professional lives? And if so, maybe that's something that the association appropriately has a view on and can process complaints on and set expectations for. Associations can absolutely promote diversity of representation. And we hear in that documentary how very important it is to have that diversity visible. Jackie talked about going into her engineering class and looking for those few other women. Setting award criteria. This is something associations have ownership of. You create awards, and not to have a spoiler alert here, but in the documentary, there was someone talking about working with Watson and Crick, who obviously have achieved enormous amounts in their profession and win the Nobel Prize and all of that. But Crick does not. Crick is a harasser, according to the documentary. So if that individual were put forward to your association now to receive an award, are you going to look at just what their professional accomplishments are? Or are you going to look at whether their conduct meets the expectations you have for your members and that you've articulated in the conduct policies? It's important to approach this on two levels. One, sort of what you're doing prospectively, and one, in terms of what you're doing for past awardees. There's a higher bar for rescinding a past award, and you're doing greater reputational damage to a past awardee to strip them of something. No one has the right to be bestowed an award by you, so you have more leeway there. And that's something maybe we can discuss more later, but I want to be sure to leave time for questions and discussion. You're in the perfect position to gather and share data and to develop and highlight what best practices are. You can survey your members, you can survey the individual members and organizational members. You can find out from them about what they do that is helping make them leaders in terms of promoting diversity. Another thing I noticed about the Picture of Scientist documentary was when MIT took ownership of its problem in terms of gender discrimination and endorsed that. Other research institutions followed suit. MIT established a childcare center on campus and was able to increase its female tenured faculty as a result. What are your members doing that is helping to promote not only hiring more women STEM professionals, but retaining them? Are they, for example, having equal paid parental leave and encouraging their male professionals to take that, so that it's not viewed as just a women's issue, and also so that those who are stepping back from their professional lives for childcare reasons aren't only the women? associations can create opportunities for those early in their career to earn recognition. In the sciences, where advanced degrees are so common and important, is so many professionals go through that system where it's a dependency relationship with their mentor, with the professor, they're working with their advisor, and that makes a difficult power dynamic if the advisor is not someone who supports women, who maybe even harasses or discriminates against women, because the graduate student is dependent on that advisor's recommendation in order to have career opportunities. Associations can provide other forms of recognition so that if a graduate student or someone early in their career is looking to move institutions, they have other achievements that they can include in their CV, and the lack of a glowing recommendation, maybe they can offset in some way. So providing these sorts of recognitions and opportunities and presentation of posters at conferences, et cetera, is really, really important. And in other ways, associations can cheerlead the achievements of women professionals in STEM and create mentorship opportunities so that maybe some of your women STEM members are at an organization or company or institution where they're the only one, or they're only one or two, but providing that ability for them to learn from others who have achieved in the field or are in the same place as them and moving forward is really, really valuable. So how do you go about this? To definitely oversimplify what can be a lengthier and more complicated process, always start with your governance documents and the statute that governs your particular organization, your professional society. Make sure that you understand what you're allowed to do right now, or what you need to change in the governance documents in order to give yourself the authority to establish these sorts of member conduct policies, or the ability to sanction, or to establish committees that can do this work. Define your association's values. This is a conversation with your board. This is a conversation with your members to determine what it is you want to do, how broadly you want to reach in the scope of what you cover, and what sort of behavior you think you want to set for your members. Make sure that you focus on the difference between what are aspirational values that we all seek, and at what point an association will step in to take enforcement action, and be clear about that, so that you're both to educate your members and to have that due process defense that they were on notice of the expectations. Certainly manage your own events. Think about how to make them more inclusive, more diverse, how to ensure that they are safe and not opportunities for harassment to occur. Set guidelines, make sure that it's a condition of attendance that people agree to and understand those guidelines. Train your staff in what to do if there are complaints. Consider establishing hotlines. There's a lot you can do to make sure that your conferences support the science, support the career growth, but don't support harassment or misconduct. And consider your awards policies and how you want to approach those, what kind of information you want to seek about nominees for awards, what you think is relevant in terms of defining your awards. there's a whole lot more we could talk about, but I'm sensitive to the time here, so I will turn it back to Mona and we'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Julia. This has been such a powerful dialogue about the different facets of this activity. And I think in discussing the session, the reason its breadth is so important is that it is personal, as Jackie highlighted, is systemic, as Shirley noted, and that change needs to be systemic. And Julia, it's organizational. And so for us to be able to push for change on behalf of people and science, we need to be able to implement it as association executives within the rules and the confines and the demands and the imperatives that we all weigh. I wonder if each of you would close. We have just 10 minutes, 9 minutes, 333, to speak to making real change happen at that intersection of the personal, the systemic, and the organizational, and what you'd like our attendees today to take away from this session, integrating all of them. Julia, I'm going to ask you to go first, and then Jackie, and we'll give Shirley the last word.
I guess I would like attendees to take away from this that associations can make change, can help make change, but need to go about it carefully so that they don't get targeted as doing it the wrong way. Your association reputation is part of what allows you to make change. And so you don't want to become the subject of a lawsuit that you ejected someone and didn't have the right to do it the right way. So you can do it, but do it right.
Great. Jackie?
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think awareness is absolutely key. The movie opened my eyes, right? And so really having that awareness, having the conversations, this whole event has been phenomenal because the conversations are front and center. So really having those conversations. I think third, understanding the data. We kind of tracked, like I said, about the women engineering. When I started looking across the other intersectionality segments, we've done it probably not to the discipline we should. So you've got to have the data. And then the fourth finally is there are solutions out there, right? We are making progress. It's too slow, but Shirley highlighted things that are in there and getting that education and focusing on those. And then just implementing them, creating the plan and putting them in place.
Jackie, our diversity and inclusion policy, the first ever a few years ago, was explicit about the intention and the long-term commitment, which is, in these times of acute awareness, there can be a sense of urgency, but it needs to be twinned with consistency. And so the articulation of the commitment, I think you're saying is vital as well for us as organizations to sustain this work.
Well said, completely.
Shirley, your reflections.
I just want to remind everybody that essentially this whole question of trying to avoid the legal pitfalls that can befall a society is one of the reasons that we have created the Society's Consortium on Sexual Harassment in STEM, and it basically gives us a way to kind of navigate that space so that we don't get into these kinds of troubles, because people sue. Okay, but I think the major point is that we are in a period of incredible disruption. And the disruption gives us an opportunity because that means that we can reinvent. All right. If we're going to reinvent who we are as societies, I think that we have to begin to really focus on some key issues. It was mentioned that MIT owned its problem. When it came up, it owned it and it put its narrative out there about what the challenges are. And I think that that's one of the things that we as professional societies have to do. We have to own our problems. And whether or not this is looking at our governance, looking at who speaks at our meetings, looking at who publishes in our journals, looking at the interactions of people within our meetings, all of these things, owning the problem, making sure that there are ways that we can be responsive in appropriate ways that are legally sustainable, that we do not have these kinds of challenges. But being proactive, I think, is really a critical point. You don't let stuff happen and then you try to react to it. You basically look at yourself as organizations ahead of time and you get in front of your challenges, you get in front of your problems. And I think that this notion about owning our role as standard bearers and standard setters for science is crucial. And that is something that I really want to urge us to do. I think back as a mother of two daughters, and I think back about how long I've been trying to do this work. And I wasn't able to really make this kind of shift in the community for my children. They basically experience what I experienced. Going forward. But I have a granddaughter. I have grandkids. I can't let this like pass over to her with the same kind of cluelessness that is going on. And I think we have an opportunity to take up the mantle, to move this into a very different space. But in order to do it, we have to think systems. It's not just about us. It is about what we enable. And that is, I think, critical.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Shirley, because you're right. Noting the STEM Consortium as a really important resource here that has been here for the last 3 years now, beginning to create model tools and systems. We have worked at ASHG with sort of a consistent drumbeat, engaging our governance to start with the meeting, then go to awards, then go to leadership expectations. And you look back over a 2 to 3 year period and you really see systemic change and the capacity for an organization to articulate its values as manifest by the board or manifest by the awards, awards recognition. And so it can be done, as Julia says, needs to be done, as Jackie says, and we're doing it together, Shirley, as you're noting.
Mona, yes, we are doing it together. We're doing all of this stuff together. And that's how we're going to be successful, because we are doing it together. But we may want to start with going and finding the dude wall in our organizations and taking it down.
We do not have a dude wall, but we have a science wall, and that is part of our goal. But yes, I think we're seeing that shift in real time and on real walls. So thank you so much, Shirley. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Julia. Thanks to all the participants and the really great chat and resources that were in the chat discussion. And Sarah would be happy to add any resources, I think, to the meeting page to continue to share resources such as the STEM Consortium. So thank you, everyone. And I invite you to participate in the networking lunch that is coming up next on the SES agenda. I know there'll be a lot to talk about coming out of this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.